The first gray light of June 6, 1944, crept across the English Channel like a hesitant prayer. Beneath the churning waters, the largest amphibious invasion force in human history pressed forward through towering waves that seemed determined to turn back the tide of war itself. General Dwight David Eisenhower stood on the bridge of HMS Belfast, his weathered face etched with the weight of a decision that would either liberate Europe or condemn a generation to perpetual darkness under Nazi tyranny. The massive armada stretched beyond the horizon, over 5,000 ships, carrying 156,000 Allied soldiers toward the heavily fortified coast of Normandy, France. Each vessel cut through the choppy waters with mechanical precision. But aboard these floating fortresses, young men from America, Britain, Canada, and the Free French forces huddled together, their faces pale with seasickness and terror. Many clutched letters from home, rosaries, or photographs of sweethearts they might never see again. Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder of the 2nd Ranger Battalion checked his watch for the 100th time as his landing craft approached the base of Point du Hoc. The 34-year-old Texan knew that his 225 Rangers faced an almost impossible mission: scale the 100-foot cliffs under withering German fire and destroy the massive coastal guns that could devastate the entire invasion fleet. His men called it a suicide mission, but Rudder simply called it necessary. Meanwhile, on Omaha Beach, the first wave of the 1st Infantry Division, the legendary Big Red One, prepared for what would become known as Bloody Omaha. Colonel Dole, George Taylor, commanding the 16th Infantry Regiment, had drilled his men relentlessly for this moment. Yet nothing could have prepared them for the killing field that waited beyond the steel hedgehogs and barbed wire of Hitler's Atlantic Wall. The German defenders, under the command of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, had spent months transforming the Norman coast into an impregnable fortress. Rommel, the Desert Fox who had earned his reputation in North Africa, understood that this battle would determine the fate of the Third Reich. From his headquarters at La Roche-Guyon, he had overseen the construction of massive concrete bunkers, underwater obstacles, and interlocking fields of fire designed to slaughter any invasion force before it could establish a foothold on European soil, as referenced in Stephen Ambrose's comprehensive work D-Day, June 6th.
By 1944.
The psychological pressure on both sides was immense. The Allied soldiers knew they carried the hopes of the free world on their shoulders, while German defenders understood that failure here meant the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. The pre-dawn hours brought the thunderous roar of Allied bombers passing overhead, their payloads intended to soften German defenses. British Lancaster bombers and American flying fortresses dropped thousands of tons of explosives on suspected enemy positions. But cloud cover and the fear of hitting their own advancing forces meant many bombs fell harmlessly inland. The psychological effect was profound. However, both sides knew that the decisive moment of the European war had finally arrived. In the distance, the cliffs of Normandy loomed like ancient sentinels, their faces scarred by centuries of wind and rain. Soon they would be scarred by something far more terrible, the desperate struggle between tyranny and freedom that would echo through history as the longest day. 3 days earlier, on June 3, 1944, the weather gods seemed determined to postpone the liberation of Europe indefinitely. Group Captain James Martin Stagg, the chief meteorologist for Operation Overlord, stood before the most powerful military leaders in the world and delivered news that struck fear into their hearts. A massive storm system was approaching the English Channel, bringing with it winds that would make amphibious landings impossible and waves that could swamp landing craft before they reached the beaches. General Eisenhower sat in the war room at Southwick Park, surrounded by his key commanders. British General Bernard Law Montgomery, commanding all ground forces. Admiral Bertram Ramsay, overseeing the naval operation. And Air Marshal Trafford Lemallory, responsible for air support. The tension in the room was palpable as each man understood the implications of delay. Postponing the invasion meant waiting until the next favorable tide conditions nearly a month away, during which time German defenses would only grow stronger and the element of surprise might be lost forever. The massive logistical machinery of distinct Operation Overlord had already been set in motion. Along the southern coast of England, from Portsmouth to Weymouth, over 150,000 soldiers had been sealed into their departure areas since late May. These young men, whose average age of 26, represented the cream of Allied military might, battle-hardened veterans of North Africa and Italy, alongside fresh-faced recruits who had never seen combat. They played cards, wrote letters, and tried to ignore the gnawing fear in their stomachs. Private First Class John Robert Slaughter of the 29th Infantry Division spent his final hours before embarkment reading his Bible and thinking about his home in Bedford, Virginia. His small town had contributed more soldiers per capita to the war effort than perhaps any other community in America. By the time the sun set on June 6th, Bedford would have paid a terrible price for freedom. 19 of its sons would lie dead on the beaches of Normandy, making it the community that suffered the highest per capita D-Day losses in the nation. Across the Channel, German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had left his coastal defenses to return to Germany for his wife's birthday and to plead with Adolf Hitler for more reinforcements. Rommel believed the invasion would come during the next period of favorable weather and tides. But he also knew that once it began, Germany would have perhaps 48 hours to throw the Allies back into the sea or face inevitable defeat. His absence during the crucial early hours of June 6th would prove to be one of the war's most significant coincidences. The German 15th Army, stationed at Pas-de-Calais, remained convinced that Normandy was merely a diversion and that the real invasion would come at the narrowest point of the Channel. This misperception, carefully cultivated by Allied deception operations, including the fictional 1st United States Army Group, supposedly commanded by General George Smith Patton, to keep an entire German army out of the battle during its pivotal, most critical phase. Colonel Hans von Luck, commanding the 21st Panzer Division's Reconnaissance Battalion, had spent months studying potential invasion beaches. A veteran of campaigns in Poland, France, and Russia, von Luck possessed an intuitive understanding of military operations that told him something momentous was approaching. His requests for permission to move his armored units closer to the coast had been denied by higher headquarters, leaving him frustrated and his tanks positioned too far inland to immediately influence the coming battle. On June 4th, clouds gathered over the Channel. Eisenhower made the agonizing decision to postpone the invasion by 24 hours. The disappointment among the troops was crushing. Many had already psychologically prepared themselves for battle, and the additional day of waiting stretched their nerves to the breaking point. Some soldiers broke down completely, requiring medical attention for combat fatigue before they had even heard a shot fired in anger. But meteorologist Stagg had detected something in the weather patterns that offered a glimmer of hope. A brief window of improved conditions might open on June 6th, lasting perhaps 36 hours before the next storm system arrived. It would be marginal conditions at best, but it might be enough for the greatest gamble in military history. At 0 for 15 hours on June 5th, 1944, General Eisenhower stood in the operations room at Southwick Park, facing the most consequential decision of his life. Outside, rain lashed against the windows, while wind howled through the ancient oaks surrounding the manor house. Group Captain Stagg had just delivered his updated weather forecast. The storm would break temporarily, providing a narrow window of marginally acceptable conditions. Beginning early on June 6th, the Supreme Allied Commander looked around the room at his subordinate commanders, each face reflecting the enormous weight of the moment. Montgomery, ever confident, argued for proceeding with the invasion. The British general had waited years for this opportunity to return to European soil and complete the work begun at El Alamein. Admiral Ramsay expressed concerns about naval operations in rough seas, but acknowledged that his fleet could accomplish its mission if the weather improved as predicted. Air Marshal Lemallory remained pessimistic about flying conditions, but agreed that postponement carried greater risks than proceeding. Eisenhower walked to the window, staring out into the stormy darkness. Behind him, the greatest military commanders of the age waited in silence for his decision. The fate of millions hung in the balance, not just the soldiers who would storm the beaches, but the enslaved populations of occupied Europe who had endured for years of Nazi brutality. In concentration camps across the continent, prisoners who had given up hope might yet see liberation. In the ghettos of Warsaw and Lodz, where Jewish resistance had been crushed but not forgotten, the dream of freedom flickered like a candle in the wind. "The question is," Eisenhower said quietly, turning back to face his commanders, "just how long can you hang this operation on the end of a limb and let it hang there?" The room remained silent. Every man present understood that delay meant not just postponing D-Day, but potentially losing the war. German scientists were working frantically on new weapons, jet aircraft, rockets, and perhaps even atomic weapons. Each day of delay gave the enemy more time to perfect these tools of destruction. At 0 for 30 hours, Eisenhower made his decision. "Okay, let's go." Those three simple words set in motion the largest military operation in human history. Within minutes, coded messages flashed across radio networks from Scotland to Gibraltar. Halcyon +5 finally and definitely confirmed. The invasion was on. Across southern England, the machinery of war lurched into motion with mechanical precision. Like at airfields throughout the country, paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions blackened their faces. With burnt cork and checked their equipment one final time, Staff Sergeant Harrison Summers of the 101st Airborne, soft-spoken farmer from West Virginia, loaded his rifle and prepared for a jump that would make him one of the most decorated soldiers of D-Day. By nightfall, Summers would single-handedly assault and capture 4 German strongpoints, earning the Distinguished Service Cross and a place in military legend, the British 6th Airborne Division. Under Major General Richard Nelson Gale prepared for their own crucial mission, seizing the bridges over the Caen Canal and Orne River to protect the eastern flank of the invasion. Major John Howard's glider-borne force would land within yards of their objectives in what would become known as the most precise military operation of the war. Howard, a former police officer from Oxford, had trained his men to perfection through months of rehearsals on exact replicas of their targets at sea. The massive invasion fleet began its final approach to the Norman coast. Admiral Alan Goodrich Kirk, commanding the American naval forces, watched from the bridge of USS Augusta as his ships formed into their assault formations. The destroyer USS Corey, under Commander George Dewey Hoffman, took its position close to shore to provide fire support for the assault troops. Neither Kirk nor Hoffman knew that Corey would become the first major Allied vessel sunk on D-Day. A victim of German mines that would claim the lives of 24 brave sailors in German bunkers along the Atlantic Wall. Sentries peered through the rain and darkness, unaware that history was bearing down upon them with irresistible force. The longest day was about to begin. Nothing would ever be the same. At 2300 hours on June 5, 1944, the steady drone of aircraft engines began building over the English countryside like distant thunder. Across dozens of airfields from Devon to Norfolk, paratroopers filed aboard transport planes that would carry them into the heart of Nazi-occupied Europe. These young men, laden with over 100 pounds of equipment each, moved with the quiet determination of soldiers who knew they were about to make history. Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Hayes Vandervoort of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment limped aboard a C-47 Dakota, despite a broken ankle suffered during training. The 27-year-old officer from Gasport, New York, had refused medical evacuation, knowing his men would need experienced leadership in the chaos that awaited them in Normandy. Vandervoort's decision to jump with his regiment despite his injury would inspire his soldiers to extraordinary acts of courage and help secure the critical town of Centmere, Iglis, the first Pathfinder. Aircraft crossed the Norman coast at 00:15 hours on June 6th. These elite soldiers, equipped with special radio beacons and lights, had the crucial mission of marking drop zones for the main force. Sergeant Elmo Bell, of the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment, checked his Eureka beacon as his plane approached Drop Zone A near Centmere, Iglis. Bell and his fellow Pathfinders represented the spearhead of the Allied assault if they failed to accurately mark their zones. Thousands of paratroopers would be scattered across the Norman countryside, easy prey for German defenders. The German response was immediate and devastating. Flak batteries along the coast opened fire, filling the night sky with deadly bursts of exploding steel. Anti-aircraft guns at Merville, under the command of Lieutenant Raymond Steiner, engaged the low-flying transports with murderous accuracy. Many C-47s, designed for cargo transport rather than combat, burst into flames under the intense fire. Paratroopers watched in horror as neighboring aircraft disintegrated, their crews and passengers disappearing into the darkness below. Sergeant John Robert Steele of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment found himself in an impossible situation as his aircraft approached Saint-Mire-Église. The town square was ablaze from a building fire, illuminating the night sky and making the paratroopers perfect targets for German defenders. As Steele jumped from his burning transport, his parachute caught on the church steeple, leaving him dangling helplessly above the battle, raging in the streets below. For hours he would hang there, feigning death while German soldiers fought American paratroopers in the square beneath his feet. Major General Maxwell Davenport Taylor, commanding the 101st Airborne Division, landed miles from his intended drop zone in a Norman swamp. The 53-year-old West Point graduate found himself alone in enemy territory with only a pistol and his wits. Taylor, who would later become chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, spent the early hours of D-Day gathering scattered paratroopers and organizing them into effective fighting units. His leadership in those crucial first hours helped prevent the airborne assault from dissolving into chaos. The British 6th Airborne Division faced equally challenging conditions on the eastern flank of the invasion. Major John Howard's glider force approached the Caen Canal Bridge, later renamed Pegasus Bridge, and 6 Horsa gliders towed by Halifax bombers. As they released from their tow aircraft at 5,000 feet, Howard could see the outline of his objective in the moonlight. The former police officer had trained his men to perfection for this moment. But nothing could prepare them for the violence of a glider crash landing in hostile territory. Howard's lead glider, piloted by Staff Sergeant Jim Walwork, touched down at 0016 hours, just 50 yards from the bridge. The impact was tremendous. Several soldiers were knocked unconscious, and the glider's structure partially collapsed. But within minutes, Howard's men were storming across the bridge, overwhelming the surprised German defenders in a fierce firefight that lasted less than 10 minutes. Private William Gray became the first Allied soldier to die on D-Day when a German sniper's bullet found its mark. But his sacrifice helped secure this vital objective. Sergeant Oliver Boland of the 2nd Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry was among the first soldiers across Pegasus Bridge. The young Englishman from Birmingham had joined the army to escape poverty, but found himself instead at the center of the most important battle of the 20th century. Boland's section cleared the eastern end of the bridge, while Howard's other gliders landed nearby, their occupants quickly organizing to defend their prize against inevitable German counterattacks by 0200 hours. Thousands of Allied paratroopers were scattered across the Norman countryside in small groups, many miles from their intended objectives. But these elite soldiers had trained for exactly this situation. Using cricket toys and password challenges, they began finding each other in the darkness, forming impromptu units that moved toward their assigned missions with deadly purpose. The airborne assault, despite its chaotic beginning, was achieving its primary objective, creating confusion in German rear areas and seizing key terrain features that would be crucial to the success of the seaborne landings now just hours away. At 0530 hours on June 6, 1944. The first landing craft approached the Norman shore through towering waves that crashed over their bows like liquid mountains. Naval bombardment from Allied warships had been pounding German positions for over an hour. But as the initial assault waves neared the beaches, an ominous silence fell over the coastal defenses. Quiet was deceiving behind their concrete and steel fortifications. German machine gunners waited with disciplined patience for their targets to come within range. Omaha Beach, codenamed for the assault, stretched for 6 miles between Verville-sur-Mer and Colville-sur-Mer. Here, the 1st Infantry Division and 29th Infantry Division would face the most heavily defended sector of the Atlantic Wall, the German 152nd Infantry Division, commanded by Colonel Dietrich Krase, had transformed. this stretch of coastline into a killing field of interlocking bunkers, trenches, and artillery positions designed to destroy any landing force before it could establish a foothold. Lieutenant Ray Nance of Company A, 1st Battalion 100, 16th Infantry Regiment, crouched in the bow of landing craft vehicle personnel number 1449 as it struggled through the heavy seas toward the easy red sector of Omaha Beach. The 23-year-old officer from Roanoke, Virginia, had trained his men for this moment through months of amphibious exercises, but nothing had prepared them for the reality of combat landings under fire. Around him, soldiers from Bedford, Virginia, his hometown neighbors and childhood friends, gripped their rifles with white knuckles and fought seasickness, while German artillery began finding their range at 0630 hours. The ramps of the first landing craft dropped into the surf, and American soldiers waded into the freezing waters of the English Channel. Immediately, the careful precision of military planning collapsed into chaos. The strong current had carried many landing craft far from their intended sectors, depositing assault troops in front of the heaviest German defenses. Machine gun nests that naval bombardment had failed to destroy opened fire with devastating effect, cutting down soldiers before they could reach the beach. Sergeant Philip Strechik of the 2nd Ranger Battalion found himself in chest-deep water, struggling to reach shore while German bullets whined overhead like angry hornets. The 30-year-old veteran of the North African campaign had survived Kasserine Pass in Sicily, but nothing in his combat experience compared to the horror of Omaha Beach. Around him, bodies floated face down in the crimson surf while wounded. Men cried for medics who were themselves pinned down by enemy fire. The German defenders fought with desperate courage, knowing that failure here meant the beginning of the end for the Third Reich. Oberkreiter Heinrich Severloh, manning a machine gun in strongpoint W172, fired over 12,000 rounds during the morning assault, becoming known to American survivors as the Beast of Omaha Beach. From his position overlooking the easy red sector, Severloh could see the entire panorama of the landing thousands of Allied soldiers. Struggling through the surf under murderous fire from his comrades in nearby bunkers, Captain Joseph Dawson of Company G's 16th Infantry Regiment rallied his decimated unit at the base of the cliffs below Colville-sur-Mer. The 24-year-old officer from Corpus Christi, Texas, had seen half his company killed or wounded in the first hour of the assault, but he refused to allow the attack to stagnate in the killing zone of the beach. Using hand signals and shouts over the noise of battle, Dawson organized small groups of soldiers to begin the dangerous ascent of the bluffs overlooking Omaha Beach. Staff Sergeant Harrison Summers, the quiet farmer from West Virginia, found himself separated from his unit and facing a series of German strong points single-handedly, armed only with his M1 Garand rifle and an inexhaustible supply of courage. Summers began a one-man assault on enemy positions that would make him a legend. Moving from building to building through the village of St. Martin-d'Aurevel, he systematically cleared German resistance points, often fighting alone against overwhelming odds, at Utah Beach, the westernmost landing zone. The assault proceeded more smoothly thanks to lighter defenses and better naval gunfire support. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., 56-year-old son of the former president, had insisted on landing with the first wave, despite his age and poor health. Roosevelt, walking with a cane due to arthritis and heart problems, became an inspiring figure as he moved among the assault troops, organizing the advance inland despite being over a mile south of the intended landing zone. The German defenders at Utah Beach, elements of the 709th Infantry Division, under Colonel Karl Wilhelm von Schleben, fought stubbornly, but lacked the strength to contain the American assault. Private Arthur Peterson of the 4th Infantry Division was among the first soldiers to breach the seawall, opening gaps that allowed follow-in forces to pour inland toward their objectives. Peterson, a 19-year-old farm boy from Iowa, had never seen the ocean before joining the Army, but his courage under fire helped establish the crucial foothold that would grow into the liberation of Western Europe. By midday, the fate of the invasion hung in the balance. At Omaha Beach, American forces clung to narrow footholds at the base of the cliffs, while German reinforcements moved toward the coast to drive them back into the sea. The next few hours would determine whether D-Day would be remembered as the beginning of liberation or as one of the greatest military disasters in history. By noon on June 6, 1944, the outcome of the greatest military gamble in history remained uncertain. At Omaha Beach, American forces had established only tenuous footholds along the base of the bluffs, while German defenders maintained devastating fire from their clifftop positions. Bodies littered the sand and floated in the surf, stark testimony to the price of liberty. Yet among the chaos and carnage, individual acts of heroism were slowly turning the tide of battle. Colonel Charles Davis Wynne Canham, commanding the 116th Infantry Regiment, moved among his scattered companies despite a shrapnel wound in his wrist. The 50-year-old veteran of World War I understood that leadership visibility was crucial during such desperate moments. Canham, limping along the beach with his arm in a makeshift sling, became a rallying point for demoralized soldiers. His famous words, "They're murdering us here. Let's move inland and get murdered," captured both the grim humor and indomitable spirit that would carry American forces off the killing ground of Omaha Beach. General Friedrich Dollmann, commanding the German 7th Army responsible for defending Normandy, found his units scattered and communications disrupted by Allied air attacks and French resistance sabotage. The 59-year-old Bavarian had fought in World War I as a young officer, but the scale and intensity of modern warfare had evolved beyond his comprehension. Many of his subordinate commanders, including Colonel Dietrich Krase of the 352nd Infantry Division, fought magnificently with inadequate resources against overwhelming odds. The success of D-Day extended far beyond the beaches themselves. French civilians, who had endured 4 years of Nazi occupation, began to believe that liberation was finally at hand. In the town of Saint-Mère-Église, Mayor Alexandre Renault emerged from his basement to find American paratroopers occupying the town square, where German soldiers had patrolled just hours before. The elderly Norman, who had hidden Allied aviators and supported the resistance throughout the occupation, wept openly as he shook hands with his liberators. The breakthrough came when small groups of Rangers and infantry, led by officers like Captain Joseph Dawson and Lieutenant Stanley Schwartz, began finding paths up the seemingly impossible bluffs. These narrow trails, invisible from the sea but discovered through desperate exploration, allowed assault troops to outflank German positions that had been holding up the entire landing. Schwartz, a 23-year-old from Brooklyn, led his platoon up a shepherd's path while under continuous fire. Reaching the cliff top and attacking German bunkers from behind, Private First Class Carlton Barrett of Company A, 1st Battalion, 116th Infantry Regiment, found himself among a small group of soldiers who had made it to the base of the cliffs near the Vierville Draw. The 19-year-old from rural Virginia had watched most of his unit die in the surf. But rather than surrender to despair, he began climbing the rocky face of the bluff using his bare hands. Barrett's determination inspired other soldiers to follow, creating the first significant penetration of German defenses at Omaha Beach. Meanwhile, at Pointe du Hoc, Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rutter's Rangers faced their own seemingly impossible mission. The 2nd Ranger Battalion had successfully scaled the 100-foot cliffs under intense fire, only to discover that the massive coastal guns they had come to destroy were wooden decoys. The real artillery pieces had been moved inland, leaving Rutter's men holding a precarious position against mounting German counterattacks. Despite this setback, the Rangers' seizure of Pointe du Hoc prevented German forces from using this commanding position to fire down upon the landing beaches. Captain Leonard Lommel of the 2nd Rangers, a veteran of the Italian campaign, led a patrol inland from Pointe du Hoc in search of the missing guns. The 24-year-old from New Jersey found the artillery pieces hidden in an apple orchard, unguarded and ready to fire on the invasion fleet. Using thermite grenades, Lommel's small team destroyed the guns that could have devastated the entire operation. His initiative and courage saved countless Allied lives and helped ensure the success of the invasion. the British and Canadian sectors gold. Juno and Sword Beaches saw more rapid progress as German defenses proved less formidable than expected. The British 50th Infantry Division, veterans of North Africa and Sicily, overwhelmed German positions at Gold Beach with professional efficiency. Major Stanley Hollis of the Green Howards became the only man to win the Victoria Cross on D-Day, single-handedly destroying 2 German pillboxes and saving the lives of his comrades. At Juno Beach, Canadian forces of the 3rd Infantry Division faced heavy resistance from German defenders, but pressed forward with characteristic determination. Major Lockie Fulton of the Royal Winnipeg Rifles led his company in a fierce assault on German strongpoints, fighting house to house through the seaside village of Courcelles-sur-Mer. The 31-year-old schoolteacher from Manitoba had traded his classroom for a battlefield, but his leadership skills proved equally valuable in both environments. Sword Beach, the easternmost landing zone, saw British forces link up with airborne troops who had seized Pegasus Bridge hours earlier. Lord Simon Christopher Joseph Fraser, known as Brigadier the Lord Lovett, led his 1st Special Service Brigade inland from the beach to the sound of his personal piper, Bill Millen, playing Highland tunes. This seemingly theatrical gesture had a profound psychological effect on both Allied and German forces. The sight of Scottish soldiers advancing to the sound of bagpipes under fire became one of the most memorable images of D-Day. By late afternoon, German resistance along most sectors was beginning to crumble as Allied reinforcements poured ashore, and the initial shock of the landing gave way to sustained pressure. General Dietrich Krase, commanding the German 352nd Infantry Division, had fought his troops to exhaustion attempting to hold the Atlantic Wall. His calls for armored reinforcements went unanswered, as a German high command remained convinced that Normandy was merely a diversion from the real invasion. Yet to come at Pas-de-Calais, the absence of German armor proved crucial to Allied success. The 21st Panzer Division, the only major armored unit within immediate striking distance of the beaches, spent precious hours attempting to receive clear orders from higher headquarters. When they finally moved toward the coast, Allied air superiority made daylight movement suicidal. Fighter bombers of the Royal Air Force and United States Army Air Forces destroyed German columns before they could influence the battle, leaving coastal defenders to fight alone against overwhelming odds. As evening approached on the longest day, it became clear that the Allies had achieved their primary objective, a permanent foothold on the European continent. The price had been terrible, over 9,000 Allied casualties, but the door to Nazi-occupied Europe had been kicked open, and nothing would ever close it again. As darkness fell on June 6, 1944, the beaches of Normandy presented a scene of organized chaos that would haunt and inspire witnesses for generations. The initial terror of the morning assault had given way to the methodical business of war. Medics treating wounded soldiers by the light of burning landing craft, engineers clearing obstacles from the sand, and quartermasters establishing supply dumps, while German artillery continued to fall sporadically among the growing Allied beachhead by 23:59 hours. Over 156,000 Allied soldiers had set foot on French soil, establishing a foothold that stretched nearly 50 miles along the Norman coast. The cost had been grievous, over 4,000 Allied casualties, with the Americans at Omaha Beach bearing the heaviest losses. Yet the strategic objective had been achieved. Hitler's Atlantic Wall had been breached, and the long-awaited Second Front in Europe had become reality. The human drama of D-Day continued to unfold in countless individual stories of courage and sacrifice. Private Harold Baumgarten of the 116th Infantry Regiment, wounded 5 times during the assault on Omaha Beach, had somehow survived the massacre at the water's edge to become one of the war's most decorated soldiers. The 20-year-old from the Bronx would carry physical and emotional scars from D-Day for the rest of his life, but his testimony would help preserve the memory of his fallen comrades for future generations. Captain John Mackenzie Durnford Slater, commanding No. 3 Commando, had led his men in a daring assault on the German battery at Weistrum. The 35-year-old British officer, a veteran of commando raids from Norway to North Africa, understood that D-Day represented the culmination of years of careful preparation and training. his unit's successful destruction of the coastal battery eliminated a major threat to the British landing beaches and demonstrated the effectiveness of specialized assault troops. The German perspective on D-80 revealed a military machine caught off guard by Allied deception and hampered by command paralysis. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, absent from his headquarters during the crucial early hours, returned to find his carefully constructed defenses in Allied hands. The Desert Fox, who had promised Hitler that he would throw any invasion back into the sea within 24 hours, now faced the impossible task of organizing counterattacks against an enemy that controlled the air and possessed overwhelming material superiority. General Friedrich Dollmann, commanding the German 7th Army responsible for defending Normandy, has found his units scattered and communications disrupted by Allied air attacks and French resistance sabotage. The 59-year-old Bavarian had fought in World War I as a young officer, but the scale and intensity of modern warfare had evolved beyond his comprehension. Many of his subordinate commanders, including Colonel Dietrich Krase of the 352nd Infantry Division, had fought magnificently with inadequate resources against overwhelming odds. The success of D-Day extended far beyond the beaches themselves. French civilians, who had endured for years of Nazi occupation, began to believe that liberation was finally at hand. In the town of Sainte-Mère-Église, Mayor Alexandre Renault emerged from his basement to find American paratroopers occupying the town square where German soldiers had patrolled just hours before. The elderly Norman, who had hidden Allied aviators and supported the resistance throughout the occupation, Madame Simone Renault. The mayor's wife had spent the night of June 5th tending to wounded paratroopers in her home, treating both American and German soldiers with equal compassion. Her kitchen became an impromptu aid station, where enemies discovered their shared humanity in the face of suffering. Such moments of grace amid the horror of war reminded all participants that they were fighting not just for military objectives, but for fundamental human values. The strategic implications of D-Day success reverberated across the globe. In Moscow, Marshal Joseph Stalin finally acknowledged that his Western allies had opened the long-promised Second Front, relieving pressure on Soviet forces in the east. The Red Army, locked in titanic battles from the Baltic to the Black Sea, could now coordinate operations with Allied forces advancing from the west, placing Nazi Germany in an impossible two-front war. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler raged at his generals for their failure to prevent the Allied landing. But the Führer's increasingly erratic leadership had contributed directly to the disaster. Insistence on personally approving the movement of armored reserves had delayed German counterattacks during the crucial first hours when they might have made a difference. The Nazi dictator, who had once boasted of building an impregnable fortress wall, had seen his greatest defensive work crumble in a single day. D-Day proved to be the turning point that changed the course of World War II and shaped the modern world. Within 11 months, Nazi Germany would surrender unconditionally, and the concentration camps would be liberated, revealing the full horror of the Holocaust to a shocked world. The democratic values for which Allied soldiers had died on the beaches of Normandy would become the foundation of a new international order based on human rights and the rule of law. The legacy of D-Day extends beyond military history to encompass the triumph of ordinary people called upon to perform extraordinary acts of courage. Tank drivers from Kansas, factory workers from Detroit, and farmers from Yorkshire had crossed an ocean to storm the most heavily defended coastline in the world. Not for conquest or glory, but for the simple belief that all people deserve to live in freedom. Their sacrifice on June 6, 1944, remains the defining moment when the fate of civilization hung in the balance. And ordinary heroes tipped the scales toward liberty. Today, the beaches of Normandy are peaceful again, marked by memorials and cemeteries where thousands of white crosses stand in silent testimony to the price of freedom. But the true monument to today lies not in stone and marble, but in the democratic societies that emerged from the ashes of Nazi tyranny. Societies built upon the principle that no one should ever again be forced to storm a beach to preserve human dignity and freedom,